Analysts forecast that the demand for Africa's resources will fall over time as newly emerging economies seek alternative sources. Now, we're joined in our Johannesburg studios by resident Geo-Economic Analyst, Mr. William Gumede. Always a pleasure to see you, so thank you very much for joining us. Let's talk about the fact that there might be a change in demand for oil globally. What would have sparked this?
Yeah. I think the first thing is, that the US has been over the years now increasingly producing its own oil. So what the US has been doing now, it has been a lot of investment in actually producing oil, from shale resources. Now that's quite important because, for the last decade or so, a lot of the US oil actually came from West Africa, from Angola, and so on. Now these days, the US actually doesn't need to get, to secure oil from West Africa or from places as Nigeria anymore because it's, it's starting to, to produce its own oil. Now that really is a big problem for African economies because most of the big growing economies in Africa the last few years have been based on oil or on any other, a single metal.
Why did they only figure out now that they could, create their own resources or find other revenues to tap into?
Now, this has been in the US quite a long process of doing it. There's been a strategic approach already, a couple of decades ago that they felt they're too vulnerable in terms of oil from Africa and sort of, the unstable Middle Eastern countries. So there's been a strategic approach. My worry really is whether African countries understand what's happening here and whether they are repositioning themselves sufficiently, to prepare for the day when, there will be less demand for their oil resources.
Could Africa have foreseen this and prepared for it?
Yes, because what we're having, there's two other dangers on the horizon. Yeah. The Chinese, because so far, as the US withdrew, buying oil from Africa, Chinese has been buying into African oil, so that really has sort of counterbalanced the US's withdrawal. Yeah. But now what's happening in China? Now the Chinese are also really cognizant that they should not be dependent on African and Middle Eastern oil. So they've also now starting to invest in getting, in sale resources to get oil from there. So we've got in this process, and then we have a third process where other industrial countries like the European Union, like Japan, are starting to be more energy efficient. So, they need less oil now.
Now, I want to stick to China. I mean, we've seen China undertake massive long-term investments in countries which have made recent discoveries. How much of a threat is the current 5-year plan for African exports?
If we think about it, let's just look at the US. I mean, some analysts in the US, this is, sort of in the US Energy Administration, are already forecasting by 2030, the US won't need any oil, from abroad. They'll be self-sufficient. Now, if you look at the trajectory, the Chinese trajectory, their long-term plan is already saying, by sort of, the next 5 years, they would have actually replaced a lot of the oil that they're now importing from local resources. So this is a real danger for African countries. Now, the problem with African countries, as I mentioned before, is that oil really is, for many African countries like Angola, like Nigeria, has been the pillar income generating tool for many of these countries.